Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our Modern Change Academy series. So this is a new series we kicked off a couple weeks ago. So this is the second session. They're going to be varying sessions that cover different topics, spanning multiple products. So we have change management, digital product release, and DevOps change velocity. So we'll be doing these sessions the fourth Thursday of every month. For the foreseeable future. And once you subscribe to the series, you no longer have to subscribe to the individual events. So you'll automatically be invited to all of them, and you can join whichever ones are relevant to you. So today, we're going to be covering shifting compliance left, so how to integrate DPR policies with IRM. We have Joe Offenberg here to speak. Joe, I'll let you introduce yourself. And with that, let's kick in. Let's jump in.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for joining. My name is Joe Offenberg. I'm an outbound product manager in our ITSM business unit, and I focus on mostly DevOps and DevOps change velocity and digital product release. Thank you for joining. What we have today is a really great session on very much a modern governance session on how we tie the policies that we have in digital product release that take place at the different phases of a release. We're going to show you how we can tie those policies to IRM compliance control objectives. Okay, so I'll go ahead and get started. We might make some forward-looking statements about future capabilities. So this is a safe place to do that without incurring any legal implications around that. So
also, Joe, real quick
yeah.
before you jump in, we do have a Q&A for this session. So if anyone has questions, please just post them in the Q&A and we will get those answered. Joe will stop periodically to answer some of these live. So please just post them in the Q&A section as they come up. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Yeah, so when we talk about the policies that we have in the release phases and as part of the release process, these policies typically, they don't live in a vacuum. They're not just for the benefit of application development, although some of them are, right? Some of them are to make sure that we're following development best practices and the best practices of application development teams. But many of them are actually dictated by risk frameworks that exist at a much higher level and exist across the entire company, and in some cases across the entire geographical region. And these could be things like COBIT or ISO 27000 compliance regulations. In Europe, you have GDPR regulations. So there's quite a few of these frameworks that have implications for all the different workflows we have in ServiceNow, but very much so around the release of new software and new digital products, right? And also the release process in general. So what we're going to do is we're going to show you how not only can we apply policies during the release process, and those policies themselves are very valuable in automating a lot of what's required, but those policies could actually be reflected in the status of compliance at a corporate level for these frameworks, and that's extremely valuable. There are a lot of different personas involved in this process, so let's take a look at them. The enterprise architect, right? They're responsible often around the tooling and the connectivity between the various platforms, and also what the process that the developers use in the implementation of DevOps and so on. Often they have to prepare these audit reports on how well teams are following those processes. In many cases, it's a manual process, right? They have to often dive into each team's release and see if the correct steps were followed. Many times they're required to attest, which is a manual step. Basically, they'll get an email, they have to check a box, they have to attest to the fact that, okay, a security scan was done, or a certain type of test was done in the release process. And that's simply just a check of a box that a human does, and it's not always accurate, and it doesn't always meet the compliance requirements. So what we do with digital product release is we actually have checks on the actual data that make up the results of that test. So if you run a security scan in your pipeline, we can get the results. And this is a very valuable time saver, not only for the architect, but also the developers, right? They're making all the changes, they're committing it to Git repositories. A lot of those changes are susceptible to these type of policy checks, and we want to make sure that as we increase compliance, we're not also increasing the burden on these developers, okay? And then, of course, the compliance managers, and often these folks are, in a different organization, in a different part of the world sometimes, and they have to understand what's happening within these autonomous development teams who are very much no longer part of IT anymore, right? If you've seen any of our presentations on digital product release, one of the reasons we created that solution was to provide governance around these autonomous teams, which have moved closer to the business units and away from IT. However, the compliance responsibility still belongs under the IT organization or under a compliance organization that's part of centralized governance. And they have to be able to capture what's happening across many different application teams, in some cases, thousands of different applications across the world, and roll that up to whether things are, that they're following these control objectives and these compliance frameworks. Okay, and that's why this is important. And I'm going to show you exactly how we can take all the different things that are happening in the DevOps pipelines, in the release pipelines, and roll that up to these compliance checks. Okay, so we have a lot of customers that have come to us over the years and say, hey, this is a problem they've been trying to solve. Auditing is a big part of what IT organizations do, and it's not just it's a function at every level, right? So you might have a compliance manager that's constantly being approached by internal auditors or sometimes third-party auditing organizations like consulting firms that come in and audit, and we have to provide the data that shows that they're in compliance. And the other customers we've had over the years, such as DMV is a great example. They undergo multiple audits a year. They have 2,800 control objectives. They must ensure compliance. And each one of those control objectives can have, hundreds of controls, specific things that have to be checked. So, the numbers are, astronomical when you look at it across a whole organizations. And as far as developers, the developer productivity can be impacted by this, right? Because the burden on developers to actually document things that they're doing, even if they're being done in an automated way, but to still account for that in a comprehensive aggregation of all the changes they're making, can be really quite a bit. So, we want to reduce that administrative burden on the developers as well, and on the application teams, and give them some more time to develop software and create fixes and enhancement requests. Okay, so where does this fit into the IRM product? Well, if we look at the solution here, I'll take you through, step by step. So the risk example that I have here is you might have data breaches or financial penalties because you're not following certain procedures at the software development team level, right? And this could include using expired libraries, or, a few years ago, we had the log4j issue, and we had to figure out which application, which modules had this version of log4j that had these vulnerabilities. And it was at the development level, it may have been something that's already been addressed, but how do you prove it? How do you prove it at the compliance level that you're no longer using these log4j libraries, right? So we have the ways, the mechanisms to do that. We have also software quality checks, and there are tools that developers use, and they have this under control, right? They have this in their pipelines, and very clearly they can see, right, a development team can see by looking at their Jenkins pipeline or the ADO pipeline, hey, the software quality scan was perfect, it looks good, everything's great. And one individual team might be able to prove that very easily. But how do you prove that at the enterprise level? How do you prove that at the organization level? You need to roll this data up. And that's what I'm going to show you how we do. So in this example, you might have a control that says software quality scan on all software changes. So anytime you make a change to software, you have to run the scan tool again. And in the case of many of our customers, they use something like SonarQube or they might do a security scan with check marks or barcode, right? And that's happening in their pipeline. So those results become very important. We want to be able to show that those things are happening at every level of the organization. And then there's also the requirement not just to show that you're in compliance, but handling exceptions. And this is where IRM comes in because IRM is the top-down tool for looking at the compliance dashboard, looking at specific frameworks, under those frameworks, looking at specific controls, right? So you have this hierarchical model, and then those controls determining which ones are in compliance or not. But then there's another very important aspect of this, and that's the exception process. We always have exceptions to these controls, right? Maybe for one reason or another, you might say, okay, for this particular product, the risk is very low. We're going to allow this exception this one time, maybe for a 10-day period to deploy these changes into production without meeting this control. So you have to be able to not only track compliance, but track the exceptions as well. And very much this is a preventative control, preventative mechanism, keeping bad code out of production, but also keeping the compliance team from incurring fines and legal liabilities for these type of things being part of the product. And we've seen the headlines over and over again where there is a data breach or some type of other a change gets released into the environment. And very recently we saw this with CrowdStrike. Thousands of customers are impacted, and it has huge implications, right? So one, prevent it from happening, and then number two, prove that you prevented it from happening is really what it's all about. Okay, so how are we doing this? Well, as part of digital product release, we're using a technology that's actually been around for a few years in the ServiceNow platform, and that's called the Policy as Code engine. The Policy as Code engine is integrated with IRM. Even before digital product release was created to use it, it was integrated with IRM for the purposes of providing the policies that roll up to these controls, right? So from a digital product release, the fact that we're using the Policy as Code engine is all we have to do to make this integration work. Now, in the next release of digital product release, so in the November release that comes out, we will have all the documentation necessary so that you could implement what I'm about to show you. But the core engine that makes this happen is called the Policy as Code engine, or what we call it is PACE. Okay, so you decide as a release manager, these are the policies I might want for various aspects of my release. So maybe in the development process, we want to make sure that the builds are successful. We want to make sure that the teams follow best practices as far as controls around their Git repositories, make sure branch protection is enabled in the Git repo. These are the kind of things that are happening like at a development phase. Maybe as a packaging phase, we want to make sure that there's legal sign off, there's documentation has been reviewed, there's nothing that's like a copyright infringement and so on and so forth. These are the kind of things that are happening in the release pipeline, in the release process. And then we're going to have policies around that to control that. And I'll show you how that works in a minute. So we have these policies integrated into the application. We have the data associated with the policy, and this rolls up to PACE, and this makes its way into the control objective. And this speeds things up quite a bit. It's a lot less time spent on the audit process and the compliance process on both sides. The auditors spend less time on it. and the development and application teams are spending less time on it as well. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to switch over to a live environment, and I'm just going to show you first what I mean by bringing these policies into the release process. So in digital product release, there are really two aspects to it. If you've seen any of the previous presentations on digital product release, you'll understand that one persona that's responsible for the best practices and for creating release templates is really part of the IT organization. They manage the release process. This is done by, in our case, it'll be our release administrator, Andrew Jackson. Okay, Andrew I'm gonna show you, they create templates, and the templates are used by these autonomous application teams that are parts of different business units, right? And what do these templates look like? Well, a template is simply the phases of a release, okay? And then within those phases, the different stages of a release. So this is a major release template. This might be used by an application development team. You might have releases that do infrastructure. Infrastructure is code. You might have releases that do patches and so forth. So within that release, we have tasks that get assigned to people, but we also have policies, and both of those are part of the phases of a release. So if I drill into this particular template, I'll see that, okay, there are 6 phases. There's a planning phase, a development phase, packaging phase, user acceptance and validation. And then finally we deploy it, right, to production. But typically at each one of these stages, you're going to have different tasks that get manually executed by different individuals, but also the policies. And that's what we're talking about today, are the policies. So for each of these phases, I'll show you what those policies might look like. In the planning phase, you want to make sure that all the stories are planned, or all the approval tasks are complete for planning. In the development phase, you're going to have a lot of testing going on and a lot of build results that you could analyze, a lot of stories and things that need to be complete, code coverage, software quality compliance. This is happening in the development phase. These policies are all part of the policy as code engine. That means we don't have a human ensuring that the policy is executing. We have the policy as code engine ensuring, and basically the policy as code engine uses code. In most cases, it's JavaScript, but we also have low code ways to do this, where you simply have drop-down lists and values and things. I could show you that make their way into these phases of the release, right? So these are the policies that we want to roll up for compliance purposes in the compliance workspace. Okay. I think maybe this is a good place to stop and just to see if we have any questions. If this is all making sense to everybody.
Yeah, Joe, we had a question. This is a bit more broad, so I don't know if you want to answer now or answer it a little bit later. But from Carla Smith, we have, how is the change management process managed within a release?
Yeah, I can come back to that at the end, but that is a good question. Yeah, so that's you know, the release, the change management process is typically part of the deployment phase of a release. And then when I show you a release, I could drill in and show you the changes associated with that release. Okay. Are there any other questions?
We have one from Lori Conaway. Do you use release templates instead of change requests?
Yeah, the two things are actually independent of each other. So when we talk about release templates, these are basically governing all the phases and the tasks and policies associated with a release. However, if you look at the common services data model, right, you understand that there are build and planning records in ServiceNow, but then there are also the running environments, right? The planning and building of releases is happening all on the build and planning side of the CSDM model. When we deploy something to production, then we need a change record. Okay, so that's usually one of the stages of the one of the tasks in the deployment process would be to submit a change record as part of that deployment for each instance of that version of the release that you're deploying. Okay, so that's really how those two things are tying together. We're not replacing one with the other. Release management is all about getting versions of software ready for release, and these The changes are about now taking a version of that software that's already been deemed ready by the release process and deploying it to a CI in the CMDB, an application service or a business service and so on. That's where that, and I'll show you examples of that in a few minutes. Okay.
And
Any other questions about release templates?
there's a follow-on. Would there be multiple changes that will launch from that release or one single change?
You could have multiple changes. In fact, let me go show you that now because that'll transition us into the next aspect of this. So I'm going to go ahead and impersonate, let's say, a product owner. The product owner is responsible for multiple releases of multiple products. And I'm going to show you how the execution of this template will play out. Okay, so as a product owner, they might be responsible also for the scoping of release. That means making sure that the correct features are being delivered in each release. And that means the integration with tools like Jira or tools like Azure DevOps are going to be important. So when we bring up the, you know what, I'm gonna end the impersonation. I'm gonna do this as myself, because that'll smooth things along here. When we bring up the what's called the release planning dashboard, and I'll bring it up for that particular release. Here we go. You'll see that there are various versions of release, and each one of these is releasing a version of the product, right? In this case, it's the 4.0 release. I'm going to drill into that release. As part of the execution of that release, we are deploying changes, and if we deploy those changes to production, we will need change records. And as you see here, there are multiple change records. In this case, we have multiple change records for different builds, and they are impacting these various environments. In this case, we only open changes for production, so these are all production environments. But let's say you're deploying, the same build to a Tokyo production environment, and then another one to a production environment in New York. You're going to need two different change records because those are two different application services, two different CIs, even if it's the same software version. Does that answer the question of the relationship between release and change? Okay, great. Okay, now to move on, as part of this release execution, we are also looking at not also are the tasks complete or what the status of the tasks are, but what's the status of the policies, right? And as I mentioned before, these policies are scripts that are executing, right, using the policy as code engine to see if we're compliant, to see if the testing was complete, if all the smoke test complete, software quality compliance, and so on happens. And when something doesn't happen correctly, it's going to show up as non-compliant, right? Because here we see we have some critical vulnerabilities, for example, or software might not be in compliance. These are the things that roll up to those control objectives in the compliance workspace, right? I'm going to go ahead and show you an example of this. I'm here in a GitHub pipeline. I'm going to create another version of this artifact, okay, using GitHub. So assume that a developer has made some code changes and now they're going to go and create another build of that. We want to see if that one is in compliance. When that build completes, as part of that build process, and we'll drill in here, you see we're running the Sonar Cube scan and we're publishing all the test results and making them available. Once that happens, ServiceNow is able to pick up that data, okay? So if you're familiar with digital product release, and I encourage you to look at some of the other videos that are posted online or go to the webinars, you'll know that we are using the same DevOps data model that DevOps change velocity uses. So all the data that's happening in these pipelines is available to us for compliance checks, okay? So when that completes, we'll see the current version of this build. We can see the test results down here are in compliance. So 12 tests executed and none of them failed. That basically maps to our reading of this as well. So here we see the 12 tests passed and none of them failed. That data coming from the pipeline makes its way into the release process. We know when the development phase is complete because all these stages will be compliant, okay? But from an enterprise level, how are we ensuring that all the different application teams and all the different releases that are going on are also in compliant, right? Because as a compliance officer, I'm not really so concerned with one individual compliance check that's happening in one version of one piece of software in the environment. I want to make sure anything going to production is meeting that same check, okay? So when this pipeline finishes, and let's see if we have a new build yet, we should have just about ready to complete this. I'll see that this check, this time when it runs, maybe it wasn't in compliant, right? Maybe some new code was added that now it failed the quality compliance check, and that's what I'm waiting for. Any questions? Any new questions come in, Greg?
Nothing for the live session. So you can
Okay,
go.
so this is now completed. I am going to run another policy check. Now, the policies at the release level usually aren't happening in real time, right? That might happen once a day, or you could set the jobs to run every hour or so, or you could just run them on demand like I just did. Now that we have the results of the test, if I go to the build here, I can see that this actually has a failed execution, right? So that's something new that was just introduced. I run the policy and then the software quality scan here. If I refresh this after the policy runs, I will see that it's no longer in compliant. And the last run shows that total test 13, only 12 of them passed, right? So that's a 92% passing rate. That's not very good in the software development world. We want to see a much higher rate of passing. That is something that I'll deal with at the release level, okay? But now let's look at the compliance aspect of this. I'm going to go, now I'm a compliance officer. I have responsibility at a high level of ensuring compliance management across many different frameworks. So we have ISO 27000, we have COBIT, we have all kinds of different frameworks here. Underneath these frameworks are policies like you see here, but also control objectives. So I'm going to go to look at a control objective here. And we can see, okay, one of the control objectives that rolls up to one of our authority documents there is to make sure that we test all software changes before implementing in production. Now, for some customers, it's enough just to make sure that the test exists. And you're basically having a trust but verify relationship with the application teams. Make sure the test exists and also make sure that the test will keep things out of production. So if the test exists, that's enough to meet the control objective, okay? For other customers, they want to actually see the results of the test as compliant or non-compliant. In this case, there's 332 incarnations of this control for various releases of various products, okay? That rolls up to an 88% overall compliance level. Now you could filter that and say, only show me what's actually being deployed to production, and that would be much higher, right? Because we understand that in the development process, you will have failed tests. That's what development is all about. It's you want to fail fast and fix things and so on. So you can adjust this to what really makes sense from a compliance. Is it enough to just say, hey, the testing exists in the pipeline, or do we actually need the results of the test? That's up to you. That's up to your compliance officers to decide. We have the flexibility in the tool to work in any of those scenarios. Okay, so that compliance check shows up there for this particular control. Okay, and this is the control objective for this particular control. We can see that the 4.0 version of this product is now showing up as non-compliant, and that's the indicator I want to understand. Most of the ones that have run are compliant, and that's great. Okay, so that's the roll up of that one particular policy to the controls. The controls are part of this control objective, and the control objective is part of a hierarchical model. And that's the hierarchy. You have your COBIT or your ISO 27000, and then that requires all these control objectives to be met, and this is how that's tracked in our software compliance management. Any questions about this?
Yeah, Joe, so we had some come through. So can an item be removed from the package and not impact the overall release, especially ones that failed or are non-compliant?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to happen at the application level. So let's say you build something and it fails, you could decide, not to deploy it or not, and then it won't, it wouldn't be part of the package that the compliance check then checks, right? We are tracking every single build. Okay, so that's happening for other reasons and in tools like DevOps change velocity and digital product release. However, you decide what actually rolls up to the compliance level. And that's usually things that are actually going into production. Most builds don't go to production, but if something does, then you'd want it to be in compliant. However, let's say, you want an exception. In a few minutes, I'll show you how that exception process works. Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, one more. This also might be a bit more broad, but how does this work with DevOps? I'm not sure if you're going to get to that.
So DevOps change velocity? Is that the question? How does it work with DevOps change velocity?
They just said DevOps, but yeah, let's assume DevOps change velocity.
Okay, let's quickly show you in DevOps change velocity what happens. I think it's also important to call out that there are change approval policies that happen at the change at the deployment to production level, right? That can be very different from the policies that you're implementing on the application development teams, okay? So if we look at, and I'm going to bring up another instance here, where I have a lot more comprehensive change approval policies. So, because I think it's a good question and it's worth diving into. Where do you delineate the policies? Where do you say, okay, these policies are change policies, and these policies are application development policies that really are just about the readiness of a product to be released, right? Because that's what digital product release is all about. Is this product ready to be released? When we look at changes in the world of change management, what we're looking at is the impact of those changes. And I'm deep into a change record here. Let me find the details that we have. So for example, we have risk and impact analysis. I'm also looking at operational stability. So a lot of these things are about, when I'm about to deploy a change that came out of the release process, I want to understand what's the impact to operations, right? We know we can, look at the CMDB, we can see all the CIs that are affected, right? The affected CIs you see here. And I can say, are there any active incidents? Are there any recent outages? Is the environment stable to deploy software to? This is going to be policy on change approval policies, and I'll show you those in a minute, that happen at the change level that we don't care about at the release level. At the release level, we're just saying, hey, is the product ready to be released? Did it pass all its tests? Are there any security issues with the version of the product itself? Whereas for change management, we're going to take in operational information as well. We do want to make sure developers follow best practices. So a lot of that data might also roll up to the change approval process. But also, we might also want to look at security scans. It's really up to the auditors what they expect in a change process. But many of these things you see here, if you trust that it was done in the release process, then you don't need it in the change approval process. And I'll show you what the change approval policy might look like, okay? So that's a delineation in policies. If it's impacting the production environment and you want to understand the impact of it and you want to understand the analysis of it, and you want policies in place to make sure you don't impact production, those are the policies you focus on here. Whereas the policies in the release process are just focusing on the quality and the security of the software, whether it gets released or not. Many things get built that, and you might skip a version and actually deploy the subsequent version, but still it has to go through the process. Okay, so these are some of the approval policies you might see in the change approval process. So I guess to go back to answer the question, they're two separate things. You have change management and you have release management, and the policies are applied in different ways, but they do relate to each other. So when we look at a release, we can see all the changes that are of that, all the changes for that release that are being deployed. Does that answer the question? Does that all make sense? Okay, any other questions, Greg?
No, that's it.
All right. Okay, so I did want to talk about the exception process. Okay, so let's go back to digital product release workspace. I have a policy here that I know it's not compliant, so maybe maybe there is a reason for it, but maybe I still want to get it into production, and with the proper approvals I can. So we can see, from the mappings of this policy to the various stages of various releases, where this falls into place. So what we can do is I can actually request an exception, okay? And requesting an exception means I can take this policy and say, hey, this is low risk. Allow me to deploy it because the software issue is not that big a deal. And you can say, okay, I'll put this policy exception in place for a certain amount of time. I could go in ahead and request that. That's going to kick off a workflow for compliance managers. Okay, so if we look at the workflow, if I go back to the compliance workspace, that particular control has an owner. Okay, the owner of that control is going to be, let's say, like a compliance team, a compliance management team, and so on. And they're going to get an exception list. And if we go to the list, we can see all the policy exceptions here and all the requests for exceptions. All right, here's the one I requested for policy, and there's a workflow. Somebody has to approve this, and when that gets approved, we can see, okay, what's the impact of this? We can go through the process of reviewing it, analyzing it. Once it's approved and once it's in place, I will be able to get through the release phase, and that will show up as a as a policy exception. Okay, so everybody will understand that this was allowed to go through the release process, but it'll be very transparent. Everybody will see that there was an exception made to allow this. It's very important because there will be exceptions, and as long as there's a process in place and as long as it's documented and it's approved, this also satisfies the compliance requirements. Okay. Okay, so that's really all I have on this solution, and would love to hear some feedback. If you can post some feedback in the chat about what you saw here today, that'd be great, and whether this would be useful for you in your environment, that would also be great. And if there's something that I didn't show and you have more questions, we still have a little bit of time to cover those.
Yeah, Joe, we have a couple more questions.
Sure.
So can the request exemption process be implemented in the change management module as well?
Well, so that request process is handled right now. The change management, change approval policies don't use PACE and they don't roll up to IRM. However, that might change in the future. What I just showed you is a capability of policies in IRM. So if you have policies in IRM, then you can request exceptions. So the short answer to your question is no, you can't really implement that with the change approval policies. But hopefully that's something we could address.
Okay, and then we have, when changes are created from release management, what fields, if any, are captured in the change?
Okay, so let's take a look at that. So if we go back to our product release workspace, and I'll go to a specific release here. So we were looking at the 4.0 release, and I went through and I showed you all the changes that were created for the release. Now, there are a couple of types of changes. If I create a change manually from the release dashboard, it will create a change, and I could fill in all those fields manually. But if you're automatically creating changes, and this is done through DevOps change velocity, you can decide what fields in the change get filled in a couple of different ways. You can use templates that would fill in the fields, or you can actually push data in through the pipeline. There are documented ways of doing that. So if you have variables in your pipeline that represent data that you need in the change record, you can, when you open the change record from the pipeline, and again, this is through DevOps change velocity, you can populate fields that way. But then there's also the there's one more way to do this, and that's when you dictate that you want to create a change in your application, and I'll show you how we're doing that for this particular application. You can also specify some in what step of the pipeline you want to create the change. For example, this is my deployment pipeline. We are tracking the steps of that pipeline, and I'm saying let's create the change at the production deployment. By looking here, I can also specify some data about the change record, like the assignment group, or if I'm using a change model or not, and so on. So that's three different ways. You can do it through the pipeline. You can do it through, manually open the change, or do it through a template. You can specify the template here, and then that would fill in data, right? Or you can, fill in some fields from the step of the pipeline itself in the DevOps change velocity.
Great. So we have one more question, and then Joe, we also have a poll we want to run before
Okay,
as well.
awesome.
So for the question, have you seen companies use the release process for managing application changes and not development?
Yes, we're getting a lot of that right now because of Release Management V2 being deprecated, and a lot of customers use Release Management V2 for like application service releases and for tracking the resolution of incidents against those services when you release fixes that fix those incidents, for example. So yes, we do have a lot of customers doing that and working on that today. And the idea is that even though a lot of the terminology in the digital product release today doesn't fit, application service or service-oriented releases, it's still very valuable to use it for that purpose. Yeah. But that's being addressed. So we will be able to, like, for example, associate catalog request items and incidents and problems with the releases and tie back to business services more directly. And you'll see the first iteration of that in November. Yeah.
Great. Okay, I'm going to run a quick poll. Please feel free to keep posting questions as we do it. But let's launch this poll. Okay, so we're really just interested in learning what you're doing for release today, and gauging your interest about DPR now that you know more about it. So please take some time to fill this out, like a minute or so. Okay, we're not getting a ton of responses. That's fine. We'll go ahead and end it now and share the results.
All right, so overwhelmingly, it's about the rollout of software packages to production, and that's where the release management process begins and ends. But there are quite a few customers doing end-to-end including the life cycle, the planning and building part as well. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think when you talk about the rollout of software packages to production, you're also including not just homegrown software and application development efforts in-house, but also like commercial off-the-shelf COTS software as part of that release process too, I would imagine. So that's why that number is so high. Yeah.
Great. We do see some folks interested in DPR, but I know you're still in the early stages. For folks who do want to learn more, if you're newer, I'll share. We have a lot of good self-serve content available on our community site. So I'll share a link to an article, which I've posted in the Q&A as well. This is a good starting point to the community. It's introduction to the product. And then at the bottom of that, there's a link to an overview video and links to additional content. So we have a webinar deep dive series that we ran called our Launch and Learn. And then we also have links to our Taco training course. So there's some good stuff there. If you want to learn more, please start to poke around and explore. And then also feel free to activate the product in subprod and start to play around. With that, Joe, any final remarks?
No, just thank you everybody for participating, and thank you for allowing me to demonstrate the solution.
Awesome. And then once again, so since you registered for this, you're automatically registered for our future Modern Change Academy sessions. So we'll be posting the topics at least a month in advance for each one. So we'll try and have the calendar posted as far in advance as we can. There'll be different topics focusing on spanning multiple products, a lot of combination use cases like we saw today. So a lot of good stuff will be coming down that pipeline. So really thank you all for joining.
Thanks, everybody.